All right, Dr. Ellis is yours.
Go ahead, Doc.
All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm Darius Young. I'm an associate professor of history at Florida A&M, and I would like to welcome you all to the Black Men's Health and Meek-Eaton Black Archives Research Center for Social and Political Justice event this evening. What happened? Race and Democracy, a conversation on the 2020 election. We're going to just start off with just really a brief overview and welcome on our behalf, along with my co-director, Dr. Reginald Ellis of our center. And then I'm going to pass it over to you, Dr. Ellis, for you to moderate the discussion this evening and to introduce the panelists. All right. In 1971, civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer said that when she thought about the United States Constitution and the clause with the people, for the people, by the people, that she, quote, doubled over laughing because it's not true. It hasn't been true, but we are going to make it true. This year marks the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act and the centennial anniversary of the 19th Amendment. It is important to note that both of these legislative acts were only necessary because of the failures of American democracy, a democracy that systematically prevented Black men and women from voting a century after the conclusion of slavery. This election, Black voters made clear what scholars have known for decades, that Black people decide elections. The pandemic forced Americans to mail in their votes this year, which allowed the world to witness as they sat on the edges of their chairs, watching Black voters in Detroit, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, and Atlanta flip red states blue. And as the president continues to label the Black vote illegal, he is fanning a racial fire in this country that is just beginning to heat up. We can and should acknowledge and celebrate our sister Kamala Harris, but let us remind ourselves that the Black freedom struggle is not a product, but a process. History tells us that there will be a price to pay for this election. And I wanted to at least start off by mentioning some of those things because it's what really motivated me to research Black political movements. When I was a graduate student at the University of Memphis, we had we're trying to figure out what our topic was going to be for the dissertation and what I wanted to study and research. And I've always done research on lynchings and racial violence. And I wrote in my first seminar about a lynching that happened in 1917 of a person by the name of L. Persons, a Black woodchopper, who had been lynched in Memphis in front of a crowd of 10,000 people. You had people directing traffic and acting as police. You had cotton candy stands and peanut stands and other concession stands at the lynching. L. Persons was brought up in front of this crowd in a makeshift stage, doused with gasoline and burned alive, right? Other just horrible things happened. The crowd cheered, folks sang songs, all these horrible things happened. I remember going to my graduate advisor, telling him about all these details that happened in this lynching. And he hit us with, some of us are very familiar with the "so what, who cares" question, right? Why is that important? Unfortunately, that story is not unique to the Black experience in America. And it really forced me to go and look and study what was happening in Memphis prior to that lynching. The year before, in 1916, the person who I wrote my book on, Robert Church Jr., had organized over 10,000 Black Memphians in the city to vote. Black women played an integral role in prepping men, of course, since women did not have the right to vote in 17, and teaching in literacy schools, things of that nature to prep them for the vote. Individuals like his sister, Mary Church Terrell, and Ida B. Wells became members of his organization. And it was this whole movement that was happening in the city. when I looked at the Black political movement that was happening, and then you read the newspapers and you look at the reaction from the white community, that it was a powder keg. And what you start to look at whenever you look at these large instances of race violence is typically some form of Black political progress. We see it happen in Reconstruction. Of course, we see it with the over 4,000 people who were lynched during Jim Crow, and then all of the violence that happened during the Civil Rights era. We can also see it in more modern times with what happens post 2008 and the climate that we're currently in. And so I wanted to talk about that, right? Because it's very much relative to what our discussion is going to be about tonight. And I know Dr. Ellis has prepared some great questions for us, and I look forward to being a part of the discussion. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Ellis, so we can proceed with the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Young. What happened? Race and democracy, a conversation on the 2020 election. I want to first welcome my colleagues from around the nation, from New Orleans, Washington, D.C., and of course, Duval County, Jacksonville, to this great conversation. Before we get started, I want to go around the room and allow my colleagues to introduce themselves. And then we're going to jump right into the conversation and hopefully leave time for questions from our audience via Zoom or Facebook. I want to start with you, Dr. DeCuir. Please introduce yourself, give us a background, and if you can, just tell us what one tidbit of something that was interesting to you about the 2020 election cycle. You're muted.
Sorry. I'm Dr. Sinegal-DeCuir. I am an associate professor of history at Xavier University. I'm also department chair. And I think what struck me the most or gave me hope was the amount of new voters that were voting for the first time, and the fact that they actually cared. Because I know teaching these young students, a lot of times I come in and talk about politics and I say, well, did you watch CNN or did you watch your local news? And they look at me like I'm crazy, like what? So I was really happy to see that we had so much involvement from Generation Z and also the millennials.
Right, looking forward to the conversation. Dr. Grant, same question.
I'm Keneshia Grant. I am an associate professor of political science at Howard University and the author of The Great Migration and the Democratic Party. And so I was very interested in the ways that demographics shape this election. In particular, the South got something to say. And so I'm interested in Georgia, interested to see what might happen in North Carolina in 2024 and the years beyond that.
All right, thank you and welcome. And Obi, my Leadership Florida Connect 9, we leave no behind classmate.
Wow, man. Let me first say my name is Obi Umunna. I'm an attorney and entrepreneur in Jacksonville, Florida, but I'm also a political consultant. I was just recently the one of the North Florida political director for the Joe Biden for president in Florida, where we flipped one part of our region, which was Jacksonville, flipped blue for the first time. One of the things I think, first time in 24 years, actually. One of the most interesting things I think I saw, and I'm not a professor like everyone here, but was the different ways that people voted and how campaigns kind of handled the different way people voted. And, you know, we had so many vote by mail ballots this time, and it was different for the voters, but it was also different for the campaigns and how to handle that influx of vote by mail votes. And so that was probably one of the most interesting things that I saw, because people still voted. People were going to make sure they voted, whether it's by mail early. In Florida, you can vote early and by mail, or election day, they still made sure they voted. So,
all right, great. So that's a great segue. Before we jump into 2020, I want to go back to 2019. During the presidential primary, particularly the Democratic primary, it was clear very early on during the Democratic primary that the progressive wing of the Democratic Party was not necessarily excited about Vice President Biden or Senator Harris. Why do you think that Senator Harris and VP Biden, why did they not resonate from your perspective with that wing of the party? And we could start with you, Dr. Grant.
I think that I look to my students to kind of answer this question. And I think the answer is that the liberal progressive wing of the Democratic Party has a different imagination than many of the people who are not in that part of the Democratic Party. And so we talk about universal health care, we talk about a Green New Deal. And I think that the people who are advocating for these things believe that they can happen and believe that if we work together, they will happen. And so I think one of the things that stood out to me from that time was Elizabeth Warren, who in the debate asked Joe Biden, well, isn't this kind of the point? Isn't the point to put forward these big ideas? And I think I mentioned my students because I have to remember and remind myself all the time that they came into the world with Barack Obama as president. So by the time they had consciousness, he was president. And so we often end up in conversations with them and with people who are not as young as they are, but have the same kind of spirit about what we can't do and how we have to moderate for various reasons. And I don't think they buy it. And so I think the reason that there wasn't a lot of excitement about Joe Biden in particular was because people thought that they could have something a bit more revolutionary. I think that the thing for Kamala Harris was wrapped up in and tied closely to notions of who she was as a prosecutor in California. And I don't think that her campaign, her presidential campaign, at least, was able to do a good job of helping people understand maybe some growth that happened between the time that she was in that office and where she stood as a presidential candidate and a vice presidential candidate.
Let me follow up with you on that, Obi. What did you see on the ground during the primary as it relates to that concept?
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to echo some of the stuff that Dr. Grant said. I think, Joe represented in a lot of ways to the progressive wing not moving far enough, right? I mean, it wasn't far enough. The Senator Harris thing is a little bit more confusing just because, when you look at her voting record and you look at the bills that she's been a part of, in a lot of rankings, she was one of the most progressive senators in the Senate. And so, the prosecutor thing hurt her with progressives. But I think there's also, I'll be honest, there was a little bit more. I think there's her being a Black woman is part of that. I think there's a lot to that. But for me, what I saw on the ground was there was energy around candidates that they already were comfortable with. So there was energy around Bernie, there was energy around Warren, there was energy around Castro as well as a progressive. But but with Warren and Bernie, those are people that they were already familiar with and they trusted. And so that's where they fell. I still say this, if it was just off voting records, more progressives should have supported Senator Harris in the primary. But it was more than that, and there was a lot that went into that. But I would say majority of that happened with her criminal justice supposed record or issues in criminal justice. What people were saying about her.
You want to chime in on that, Dr. DeCuir?
Sure. Again, echoing with what Dr. Grant and Obi just said, I mean, that's absolutely true. I think that Biden obviously was not progressive enough for the progressive Democratic Party, and he was not progressive enough for all of, like I said, the Generation Xers and Zers and the millennial people who are coming in an age, as Dr. Grant said, with Obama being the president of the United States and them seeing a Black person head on right away being the president of the United States. So for a lot of these young people, they're unaware of all of the stuff that we had to go through in the past, the 90s and, the Clinton and the Reagan and the Bush era. They don't know about that. And so I think that that Biden was not on the radar because, again, the Democratic Party is moving closer towards a base that is more progressive following the youth. And I think that's going to be the big thing, even in the next 4 years to come. We have to make sure that we put Biden and Kamala's feet to the fire and make sure that they actually enact a lot of these progressive reforms, especially reforms that are going to deal with systematic racism and ending systematic racism in the United States. So that's a big one. And then also, again, like I said, the Democratic Party, even now looking further into the future, I would say, after these 4 years, we might have a backlash like we saw with Trump, right? Because after Obama, I mean, the United States just went way to the other end because it was a backlash. And so we want to make sure that we don't see that again within the next 4 years. So we want to make sure that we are appealing to the new Democratic base, and that we are still keeping those moderates there as well, because we don't want them to flip over to the other side.
Darius, I'm gonna come to you with this next question, because it's back in February, we did have quite a bit of conversation around this idea. So during the primary season in the early months, it appeared that Joe Biden's candidacy was on the ropes until about late February, when Representative James Clyburn of South Carolina issued his endorsement for Joe Biden. And we all remember the statement very well. We know Joe, and Joe knows us. And perhaps it didn't just save his primary election. Some may even argue that this is what catapulted him to the presidency. Now, scholars of critical race theory in that moment claimed that Clyburn's endorsement spoke directly to Southern Blacks, but was not a representation of the entire Black community. As it relates to this election, Dr. Young, is there a generational, and this is for the entire panel, so after Dr. Young goes, just go for it. Is there a regional or generational divide in how the Black community voted in the 2020 election cycle?
Well, okay, that's a lot. That's a lot there. First, let me just say, shout out to James Clyburn. He was a veteran of the Civil Rights Movement, member of SNCC, and definitely has the record to stand up and to, voice his opinion. And I think when we look at his endorsement, it reflects who he is as a politician, which is more of a pragmatist, right? And, just to piggyback on the previous question, when you have somebody like Trump in office, I think you have people who genuinely are leaning more to the left side of left, right? But also from a strategic perspective, I think some people felt that you needed the antithesis of Trump, right? And in order to beat him, right? When Clyburn endorsed him, again, I think it just reflected his more pragmatic approach to politics. In terms of just the way individuals voted, I haven't looked at that data necessarily, but I think when we look at the 2020 election, once it became clear that Joe Biden was the clear front runner and would eventually be the candidate, that Black folks came to support him and to support Kamala, not because they just loved Joe Biden and loved his record, or just some weak kind of play on his relationship with Obama. I think Black folks are way more sophisticated voters than that. But the urgency of removing someone like Trump kind of motivated Black folks to unite and to have a common response when we look at the fall election.
Yeah, let me hop in here, Reggie, just because I work primarily with Black voters. And one of the things I tell people about Black voters are they're the most pragmatic voters out here. And when you talk to Black voters, their concern is who was going to beat Trump. Like that was it. Like, and when they went to the polls, and said, who here is gonna give me the best chance to beat Trump? That was who they wanted to vote for. And so you saw that across the table. Now, I think there is this notion that, African-American voters weren't super excited about Biden. I didn't see that. But I also understand that Black voters rarely have choices that are their favorite, and that they're used to coming to the polls and making the best of both of a decision, right? And that's consistent for them because they don't get the options that they deserve. And that happens through party politics and all of that kind of stuff. But I didn't see that, but what I did see though was there is an effort to want a lot more from Biden, right? They want more. They voted for him, but they're not sitting on their hands and waiting. They're saying, we voted for you. We wanted you to beat Trump. Now what's next? And you're starting to hear people like Clyburn, particularly this week, speak about appointments and all of these things, right? And I think that's the other shift, right? I think what I'm starting to see now is what would happen after the election is people would be quiet, right? Or when an issue would spout up, they would talk. What I'm seeing now is you got my vote, but what else is coming? And I think that's exciting to see, because that's kind of where we need to be as a community with our politicians.
And I think you get a lesson in terms of how politics work, that we can't disregard the work that the quote unquote more progressive wing of the party did, that you need those voices in order to push whoever is going to be that eventual candidate to speak to the issues and that are most important to their base, right? That whenever you study politics, it's not always about that one election and that one specific win or loss, that it's about those incremental victories. When we look at Stacey Abrams' governor's race that she lost, we see how important she is, though, by her being able to deliver that vote 2 years later. So I can make the argument that Stacey won, right? That she may not be in that office, but the politics and how she shifted it, and the motivation that the way she mobilized that the communities in Atlanta and other places throughout the state of Georgia shows how these behind the scenes movements of politicians pushing people to think more critically about issues of race, gender, legal system, education system, that's coming from the progressive wing, where you have somebody with Joe Biden's record have to talk about Black Lives Matter and include it in a national political discourse, shows you how important it is to have those quote unquote leftist progressive voices, because it did come from a real part of the base, that they weren't just speaking out of turn, they were speaking to issues that folks, Black folks, white folks, poor people cared about, and it had to be included, and it played a role in the decision in this election.
Okay, so I want to chime in. I think that there was some generational divide, but I think what Clyburn did was he gave those older Black people permission to vote for Biden, because I think for a lot of older Black people, they are completely loyal to the Democratic Party, right? They always vote blue. I mean, that's just something that they do. They go to the polls and they look at the, Democrat, they don't care who they're voting for, just as long as they're voting for somebody within the party. And I think that that endorsement did that for a lot of older people. But what was different was that, again, going back to the young people, they are the ones that were like, well, we don't want to just vote just because it's a Democratic person. We're voting on these principles, these progressive issues. And so I think that was where the generational kind of divide came into play. I also think because there were so many people that had a progressive tone in the Democratic primaries, like Sanders and Warren, And I guess you can say Kamala in some aspects regarding reforms and police and different things like that. But they were more of the progressive side. And I think what happened was that for the youth, when they went out to vote in the Democratic primaries, they were split between those three. And that is how Biden won the nomination for the Democratic Party or whatever. And then from that point on, it was like the best, whoever is going to beat Trump, we're just going to all get on this bandwagon, and then we're going to go ahead and try to figure out how we can change things once we get the people in office that we need to be in office. And so I think that's where everything was. So it was basically the lesser of both evils, just like Obi was saying. It was kind of like what a C is better than an F, I'm gonna go ahead and take what I can get type of thing. And so I think from that point on, we saw the African-American community and even some of the Latino community coming in together and joining the bandwagon for Biden. But had they, been able to come together for one progressive choice, we might have had a different outcome.
Dr. Grant, I'm going to come to you with this next question, and again, open it up in a similar way. After the primary was over, there was clamoring from the larger Black community that Biden needed to choose a Black running mate, not just a Black running mate, he needed to choose a Black woman. So how much of an impact do you think it was that he chose Senator Harris to win this election?
So I know that's my question, but I want to return to the previous question, if that's okay. I think it's important to note that we have a age thing going on, but we also have a class thing going on. And so the way that people's progressive politics manifests look a bit different based on where they were coming from. And I think the data even show us that the people who were coming from kind of higher socioeconomic status, higher education brackets, tend to turn out in a more Warren, Kamala kind of situation than the folks on the other end of the spectrum who were a bit more Bernie-ish. And so I think if we're thinking about age, we should also think about class as we think about Black people as not being a monolith. In terms of Clyburn, I think what he really did was not necessarily give people like comfort with Biden, but I feel like what he said was, hey, y'all, you know how we always have to say the democracy is on us again. Please turn out. I know you was about to stay home, but please don't stay home because this thing about to it's going to be bad. And so I think that's what happened there. In the conversation about Kamala, I think I was one of the people who was very vocal as I could be in public about the fact that Joe Biden doesn't get to be the Democratic nominee eventually. Excuse my dog Nina, she wants to be in the conversation too. He doesn't get to be the presidential nominee without Jim Clyburn, right? So whether we love him, whether we upset about the way that he does his work as a pragmatist, that is a necessary condition for Joe Biden to be doing his work. And so if it is the case that you only have this because some Black person came and looked out for you, and if it is the case that the most reliable block of voters in the Democratic Party in recent history, and even if we think about, like Dr. Young is saying, history before we could even participate, right? The people who have been down since the beginning are Black women. If politics is give and take, it has to be the case that you support Kamala Harris or some other Black woman as your vice presidential candidate. And so I hope that the pollsters and the consultants and everybody else were clear with him about the fact that the Black turnout that they depend on was going to be a bit depressed if he did not do something that was clearly and specifically about Black people. I think that having Kamala Harris as the vice president is a good start. Right? Like we are all happy to see that start, but I don't think it's going to be enough. I think it's going to have to be that and some other things. And I think that if it's not that and some other things, the Democratic Party is going to have some issues to wrestle with in 2024. I don't know that Joe Biden will be the candidate again, but I do think that Black people could always stay home. And I know that the Democratic Party needs that to not happen in order to continue to be successful.
Yeah, I think you see that shift, right? What we see is in the 21st century, the Democrats have not won an election unless a Black person was at the top of the ticket somewhere.
Right.
Right. So clearly there's a shift that has taken place. White men are still 44-1, in terms of being president. But you see that and how important that is. And when we don't have that representation, it becomes a manifestation of the idea that our vote does not matter, that we're not just going to accept what you put up there anymore, that we'll stay home because we catching hell regardless who's in office, right? If you want us to come out in that way, and I'm just so happy that we had this mail-in vote so the world could see white folks biting their fingers, nervous, watching all those black folks trickle in painfully, just trickle in day after day in those cities and turn that tide, right? Because it showed us how much power we have. It showed the world how much power we have. We see with the way the presidential election shaped out. White folks are really 50-50, right? And that we play such an important role and we can't relinquish that power just because one guy is out, that we still have to hold these individuals accountable. But the party in and of itself has to realize that the Democrats have not put anyone in that office in the 21st century unless they had a person of color on the ticket. And so clearly it's a shift that's taking place. Shout out to Keneshia for the work that she did in her book. We're so proud of her at FAMU that you all should go check out because it helps explain that process.
Yeah,
how that shift occurred.
I'm so glad you. Thank you for the shout out for the book, but your description of what was happening, I think is spot on. But I think it's spot on because clearly that's the book, right? Black people are the balance of power. When the white vote is evenly split, then you need somebody to help you along. And obviously, this conversation should have a bit more nuance because the nation is not just black and white people. Right. But for sure, as you were saying, like you can't do it without black people.
Right, for sure. Yeah.
So I want to chime in on. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, like, I've been working on campaigns for a very long time, and like one of the things that I've noticed is there, and I said this earlier, is there's a shift in, Black people will stay home, right? Like that's a thing that what happened, what you're starting to see campaigns do is actively court the Black vote, right? Like it happens, but never like this. It's never happened like this because they realized in 2016, when they didn't have someone on the ticket, the energy was not there, right? It didn't matter the surrogates. It didn't matter who you had and who you spoke. The energy was not there. And once we had Obama, we weren't taking anything less than that. And I'll tell you, I was working on this campaign since March. Biden by then was the nominee. The energy that happened when Kamala was added to the ticket, you can't, when I tell you, like, my phone was blowing up. I had AKAs like trying to get pink and green signs for me. Like it was the energy that it was a shot in the arm to the campaign to have this Black woman, but not just any Black woman. It was a Black woman that was a senator that had done the work and was prepared to do this. And that energy we got was I can't even quantify it. And I think one of the things I try to do as a consultant is I try to not live just on Twitter, but live with the regular people and see them. We had Senator Harris here in Jacksonville, and she made a stop at a Northside library, and you would have thought she was Drake, she was any popular person. They were as happy to see her and as anyone else. And so when you have that energy on the ticket, it makes everybody's life easier. So, as somebody who works with Black voters a lot and sees that, they're not going back to not being included in stuff. And they want their day in the sun, and they want their candidates to not just represent them, but to look like them as well.
Yeah, so to chime in, I just want to say that American democracy was built on the backs of Black women, period. And so when Kamala, I think for me, what stood out the most was how strong she was when she got on Brett Kavanaugh doing that, the judiciary, what is that, for Supreme Court, right? And she got on him and she started doing those questioning. And I think every Black woman, and not just Black women, but every woman was like, yes, get on him. And then the whole thing was for the white men, it was like, how could she? How could a Black woman question a white man like that? Well, guess what? It's 2020, wake up. And I think her, by putting her on this ticket, again, it trumped up all of this support because Black women saw a strong Black woman or a woman of color, if you don't want to call her Black, because I know some people sensitive about that, but they saw a woman of color who was strong, who was going to take a stance and who was not afraid to challenge the authority of a white man. She didn't care. And I think that's what did it. That, and of course, all of the, the sororities and the fraternities, and everybody had to show out, just like you said, Obi, everybody had to show out because, she's making history. She is the first. And yeah, I think that's what did it for me. When she dug in the print.
And she did that during the debate against Biden, and she got some backlash for that. And, what I saw from what my Black women friends and myself was a Black woman going for it. And people were excited about that, right? Like people didn't want her to let and just pretend and run for second place. And that's what you're seeing, right? They didn't want her just to do that. They wanted her to go for the throat like everybody else would go for her throat. And the Black people didn't have a problem with that, but obviously a lot of people did. But I want to give, Biden a little bit of props for choosing, because a white man's ego doesn't always necessarily lead to having somebody challenge you and then you pick them, right? I think it could have gone a different way, but I definitely wanted to echo what you just said about how she put herself out there and went for it. And I think Black people respected her for that.
And I think also considering the other choices that he had, because I think he had 7 women that was on his short list, but considering the other choices, I think some people wanted, what's her name, y'all? Susan Rice, right? So there's Susan Rice would have been a better, opponent and whatever. But actually, I don't think that she would have been. And the reason is because she was blamed for the whole Benghazi, incident that happened back in the Obama administration. And so because she was blamed for that, that would have been one of the points that the Republican Party would have picked on like a scabbing sore, that she did X, Y, Z. And that could have changed the election and could have brought more people in on, voting for Trump because of that. So I think Kamala was actually a safe choice as well. She was strong, she's progressive in some means, and she will challenge the white leadership in authority. And she's gonna also make sure that there's a lot of diversity within the White House, within the cabinets, and that everybody's voice is gonna be heard. So I think, it was really strategic for him to go ahead and pick her.
Good. So for time's sake, we have a few more questions, and believe it or not, our audience is already chiming in with a few questions. So I'm going to try to fit in as many as possible before we run out of time. Today in Florida, we just hit the 1 million mark of coronavirus cases. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. On January 27th of this year, VP Biden penned an article entitled "Trump is Worst Possible Leader to Deal with Coronavirus Outbreak," which was published in the USA Today. One day prior, according to Bob Woodward, President Trump was informed of how contagious and deadly the coronavirus was. In retrospect, how impactful were the differing approaches to the management of COVID-19 on the election outcome? And I'm gonna just throw that up for anybody.
Well, I would say it was very impactful because I think a lot of people in Trump's base actually started to sway over to the other side because he did not handle this the way he should have. I mean, he knew about this from late December 2019, and we did not know anything until February-ish. I mean, you had people in New Orleans at Mardi Gras hugging everybody, all drunk in the streets, and then 2 weeks later, they had this something respiratory something, and nobody knew exactly what it was. So it's like he knew what it was. He knew that it was airborne. And what Americans craved the most was transparency and honesty. And he didn't give us any of those things. He told us not to wear a mask and inject cleaner in our body. Now, how safe is that? Do you think that's presidential? That is not presidential at all. Okay, so just that alone, lying to the American people and telling us that this is a hoax and that it's a Democratic hoax at that, right? The Democratic Party is just spreading rumors because they want to make sure that they win the election. I mean, that didn't make any sense at all. That's not presidential. And the first thing that you should do as a president is to make sure that you ensure the safety of Americans at all costs. And he didn't do that. And I think because of that, that is one of the things that cost him the election and cost him some votes from his base.
I agree. And on top of that, I think that there might have been some moderate Republicans who were not about to be gung-ho for Joe Biden, who might have suggested they wanted to just stay home, that they might not participate. But when you see the United States going through COVID as it has, or you see Florida going through COVID as it has, I'm sitting in DC and I should be at home in South Florida. You have to remember, like, the people who made that the case. When you lose a loved one, they have to can't attend a funeral because they have died from COVID, then you remember that kind of thing. And so I think that some people who might not have been activated to participate in politics, either because they are like moderate Republicans and not quite far to the right as Trump is, were motivated to do so because they could look to other nations and see, like, oh, y'all out? Like, things are better where you live. Why isn't that the case where I live? And so for sure, I think that, honestly, I don't think that the Democrats would have had as strong a shot if he didn't fumble it as bad as he did. I think for sure there would have been a lot more infighting about Bernie versus Joe Biden. But I think that the coronavirus kind of helped the Democratic Party quickly make its decision about who it was going to be behind. And I think for sure that some of the people who are Republicans chose to turn out for Biden who might not have turned out for him without that huge fumble on behalf of President Trump.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think for those folks who are on the fence, that it became clear how incompetent the president was. And that incompetence played a role in their individual safety. So you can ignore race issues, you can ignore gender issues, you can ignore legal issues, you can ignore all these other things that you have the privilege to just throw blinders on and pretend doesn't exist. But his incompetence threatened the life of those moderate Dems, moderate Republicans, whatever you want to say, who are on the fence. That is, to me, it played a deciding factor in the outcome, that we at least need a competent individual in that position who I could trust to keep me safe and wouldn't lie for their own personal goals and aspirations. That played, I think, a huge role, and it's extremely unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, Corona affected campaigning tremendously this cycle. I think from a messaging standpoint, it was a clear winner for the Dems, right? It was clear that this was mishandled. It was very easy to show that for us in a lot of different markets and that kind of stuff. From the on the campaign side, though, we really took this Corona we took it very seriously. We didn't canvass. We didn't do certain things. All our events were drive-ins, right? We had so much kind of, precaution about this. And I think ultimately that is what won Joe Biden the election. But one of the things I do want to bring up is that, we did lose a lot of down ballot seats. And actually we lost because I'm in Florida and I focus on Florida, you know, we lost seats here in Florida. And part of that, not that it was a mistake either way, because you don't want to be spreading corona, but not canvassing, not being able to do some of that stuff hurt us in some of those down ballot races. But what it did at the top of the ticket was make it clear who was a leader and who wasn't. And it made the decision even easier for those that were, as Dr. Young said, somehow on the fence after all the 4 years of stuff that's happened. It made it very clear who you were going to choose.
Speaking of the somehow and the other issues, on Memorial Day this past year, 2 months into the worst pandemic, one of the worst pandemics in American history, Officer Derek Chauvin placed his knee firmly on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. The video sparked an outcry from not only Black folk, but a multiracial group of citizens joining a movement galvanized around the near decade-long Black Lives Matter movement. What impact did the lynchings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd have on the 2020 election? Go ahead, Doc.
I'm like, I'm gonna chime in on that one.
Go ahead.
I really think it had a huge impact on the 2020 election. I mean, if you think about it, since 1619, right, when the slaves first came to the United States or whatever, Black people have always been that strange fruit hanging from a tree. From year to year, century to century, decade, I mean, all the way up until 2020, it has still been going. It's a legacy, it's history, it's, you know, and the thing is, America always tells us to turn the other cheek. You know, oh yeah, we might turn the other cheek and forget, but we'll never forget. And here's the thing, and I'm not trying to say anything is wrong with like the older people in the 60s and the civil rights movement, and even those people before them that was doing slavery. You did, as a Black person, you do what you have to do to survive, right? In a white man's world, you do what you have to do to survive. But I think right now, at this point in time, the youth, the people that we have coming up right now, they're not gonna stand for that crap. Okay, so they're going to try to figure out ways in which this is going to change, because we don't want to go on for another 20 years still having the same cycle going on and on and on. And so I think this was a huge impact on the election, because it made people start to realize, looking back at history and looking at where we are, nothing has changed. And the only way that something is going to change is if we get in, we put the right people in office, and then we hold them accountable to make those changes. And I think that's what these young people came out for. That's what even the people of the civil rights era came out for, because they fought, they were beaten, you know, and still nothing changed. So we have to do something. We have to do something. And I think this election, you know, all of that played a part in people coming out to vote.
I think it's also true that we don't get a Kamala Harris without George Floyd, unfortunately. Like, for all that I said and all that I believe about the importance of Black women in democracy, like for the history of the nation, the importance of Black women in the Democratic Party in terms of the turnout and their contributions, I still don't trust that they would have done it without a global statement about how important it is that Black people are treated like humans. And so I think for sure there are probably some people who were motivated to turn out who might not have otherwise turned out because George Floyd. But it's also the case that the Democratic Party, I think, used language that acknowledged that Black people exist and are humans and have rights and all of these other kinds of things that they might not have been inclined to do so without that, which I know is a dark take, but that's what I think.
I'm going to do a real quick rapid fire because we are running out of time. And so I have two more questions in this thought, well, to switch into polling. And I'm going to come to you on this one, Obi. By midsummer 2020, national, state, and local polls predicted a landslide election for VP Biden. On the morning of Wednesday, November 4th, 2020, the election was still in doubt. Were the polls wrong, or did the media misread them?
So you're talking to somebody who's biased. It was a blowout, right? Like, I mean, like, listen, I think one of the things I want to make sure I put this out there. When you get 306 electoral votes, when you win by 5 million votes, it is a blowout, right? That's not, you flip 5 states. That is a huge victory. But we are used to Obama winning the election and you can watch the second half of the video game or the second half of the basketball game. And we are not used to having elections where there were so many mail-in votes, right? That made counting these votes, there's some states that couldn't count their votes till election day. So this narrative that this election was close, it was the election day, but as you have seen, this is not a close election. And I want people to stop saying it was close. I mean, I worked on the campaign, so I am biased, but it is not a close election when you win by this amount. Now, could things have been called sooner? Yes, they could have. But that doesn't change the overall outcome of votes in states. So I'm just going to say that it wasn't close. Most of the polling had it right within the margin of error. But I think there's still some work to be done because people were lying to pollsters. But most of them, I know the one from my local area, which is a good pollster, he had it within 3%, and that was right on point. So they were closer. There's still some work to be done, but this was a blowout. I mean, it's hard to say it wasn't for me. So,
well, I just off the record, I texted Obi about 5 or 6 times during the process. Say, yo, are we gonna win? And he would never give me anything. So that's the best I got from you, man. Next question, very quickly.
To make sure everybody stayed vigilant, man. I wanted nobody to rest until the votes were counted. So I wasn't gonna give you, if I didn't have comfort, I wasn't gonna give you any comfort either.
Oh, well.
It worked.
I lost sleep. How about that? During the 2020 election, Stacey Abrams spearheaded a turn out the vote campaign in the state of Georgia that is now the envy of purple states throughout the nation. Was this election result, or was the election result in Georgia more about voting against President Trump, or was it about turning out more people who have not previously voted? And that's for anybody.
I'm gonna go with B, Dr. Ellis. And I'm gonna go with B because of my, I guess, approach to the world. But the South is different today than it has been recently. And so as I think about the Great Migration, the next project is about return migration. And so the people who live in Georgia, again, they just look different. They coming from different places in the nation. They have different political ideas. And I think what Stacey Abrams understood and what Andrew Gillum believed was that both Florida and Georgia might look a little different if you ask different people to turn out to vote. And so I think that the demographic change is necessary first, and then it takes a visionary and leader to come in and be like, all right, well, we got this demographic change. Let me move it and let me turn it into something that can be blue, which Stacey Abrams did convincingly.
And
she's, let me just say, she's part of a very important tradition, right? When you look at Stacey Abrams, you see Fannie Lou Hamer unlocking that same vote, that group of people who are disregarded. They're gonna call us because you have whatever letters behind your name and ask you how you're gonna vote. They went and mobilized a group of people that we always too often overlook. And so she's part of a long tradition. That's just one of many. I think Keisha Blaine is doing some good work that will be coming out on that. But I think it's extremely important when we talk about this to not necessarily just talk about 2020 as something that's so unique that happened. It's connected to a very long history. All of these different issues that we're bringing up, especially when we look at what Stacey Abrams did and that tradition of Black women in particular, organizing, mobilizing, and turning out for a myriad of issues that we're not going to get into today, but the Black vote in particular. And so I just challenge us to learn more about that history and to understand how it's all interrelated.
Second,
also say like this was 10 years this isn't overnight success.
No.
Yeah.
You know, what she did and what she built took time and effort, and it took you know, she was building it before she ran, and then she continued to build it after she ran. And so, you know, as we are talking about Florida, there's a lot of Florida people in here, you know, is the work still needs to be done in Florida, right? Like that work that Andrew started needs to continue here in Florida, because you don't get there overnight. You get there with progress and incrementally working and seeing that progress come about. And so here and where I am in Duval, there have been groups on the ground for almost 4 years doing this work before I stepped on, right? Like, so like I get credit, but they all deserve credit. And so it's a process. And if we don't do the work in Florida, it's not going to change here either.
And shout out to the HBCUs. They trained us well.
Yes. So I'm going to chime in on that one, just to say that I love Stacey Abrams. First of all, you know, in 2018, when she did not win the election with 55,000 votes or whatever, she was like, I'm not just going to be a vengeful person. I'm going to actually take action. And she started that organization, Fair Fight, to protect voters and voters' rights. And so for the 2 years, I think over 2 years, it was something like 800,000 voters, new registered voters or whatever, that she registered to vote within Georgia and elsewhere as well. So I think for, you know, Stacey Abrams, what she's doing and her model could actually be something that's implemented in many other states, right? We just have to try and figure out, we need to get the what is it, the potion. we need to pass it along and try to mimic it, you know, to continue on to have the success that she had.
let me ask one last question, and then we'll do our final thoughts. Since Saturday, November 7th, it has been made perfectly clear that VP Biden and Senator Harris is now president and vice president-elect. However, the current president has not conceded this election and has continued to challenge the legitimacy of votes cast in urban areas. What do you all believe will be the long-term effects of this on the ideas of American democracy?
I'll let somebody else go.
I think I feel like me and Darius right here tonight. So I feel like what Darius has been trying to do is signal to everybody that it's a long story.
Yeah.
Right. And so the story of a blue Georgia is a long story. The story of Black people help saving democracy is a long story. And so this story about the potential erosion of democracy in America is a long story. And so I want to be sure that anybody listening understands that what Donald Trump is and how Donald Trump does and all of this stuff has been happening for a long time. And he is a personification of a thing that has been happening for a long time. And we can locate responsibility in different places. I think one of the interesting places to locate it, and I don't mean interesting in a pejorative sense, but I mean it like, I think it's actually interesting, is how we have different information. And so you watch Fox, I watch MSNBC, you on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, and we have information environments that are curated to us, which allows for the erosion of some of our shared values. And so I think that's a really long way to say, I mean, what else was he gonna do? He wasn't gonna be like, oh yeah, you know, I just been cutting the food this whole time, but you know what, Joe, you got me. No, he wasn't gonna do that. And what he's not gonna do is go home and act normal. And he's about to be turned the whole time. And it's about to continue to be ridiculous because, again, this is not a thing that just came out of nowhere. This is a thing that has been building up for a minute. And you should expect that it's gonna continue to build. Now, I think we got some momentum coming from the other direction with like population change and demographic change and brown and Black babies being born, which is going to lead to something. I don't know what it looks like in the middle, but he doing what he said he would do.
What folks are seeing is the realization of what Black folks been saying since 1776. And is that we are not, American democracy has always functioned as a lie. because it's never included all of its citizens. And our votes have never, it's always been problematic when we talk about our own experiences at the polls. By him disregarding it, calling it illegal, which is coded language for races, you know, their votes should not count. It's what he's saying, because they historically have not, right? And I mean, we're at this moment. We're just at this moment where all of these things are being unpacked in front of everybody's eyes by him saying, I refuse to concede. I'm not giving up and this and that. I'm gonna challenge this. I'm gonna throw out your votes. It's shocking to most of Americans, but it's not shocking to Black people, because that has been our experience, us constantly pushing America to live up to this beautiful idea of democracy that unfortunately has just never been a reality. And we still have this role, and the burden, unfortunately, is still on our shoulders to try to make America realize the true meaning of democracy and function in that way. So, like Keneshia said, it's a long story, and you know, some people are just now starting to open that book.
So let me.
No, we've been saying it for a long time.
Let me slide in. I know we're virtually out of time. I want to give you all the last word. What should our final takeaway from the 2020, and you can go back to the primary as well, what should our final takeaway from this election cycle be?
Watch out for the Black vote. Watch out for the Black vote, and watch out for the youth.
Yeah.
Dr. Grant?
I think the final takeaway has to be something about, it's not actually a final takeaway, right? Like you gotta keep your eye on the ball, and the ball is gonna be moving the whole time it was moving before you started paying attention. So this is a long story, and I'm so happy that there are more people paying attention to the story now, but there's more to do and know.
Obi.
Two takeaways. One, that it was a blowout, and then B, there's a lot more work to be done. Like there's just a ton of work that still needs to be done, not just in Florida but all over. And so we can't, as Dr. Grant said, we can't keep our eye, we can't rest. And then we haven't rest. Black people have not rest, but like we cannot think that we have set us back on track. And which is why I love the Build Back Better slogan for the Biden team, because it can't go back to the way it was. Black people were still struggling. We have to provide something better, and that's going to take a lot of work, and that work still needs to happen.
All right, I want to thank you all before I turn it over to Dr. Young to close us out. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you for taking time out of, I know, busy schedules, closing out the end of the academic year and being a month removed from the presidential election. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for the work that you're doing in your fields. Thank you for turning Duval County blue, Obi. And we look forward to hearing from you all in the future on other topics and conversations. So I really do appreciate you all joining us this evening and providing your insight. Thank you again. Dr. Young closes out.
Yeah, I just echo your sentiments. Dr. Ellis, I enjoyed it. It was good seeing you all. You know, I haven't seen you all because of this current situation, but I think it's an important discussion. I hope we continue to have these discussions. Black Men's Health will be hosting a summit in January, so be on the lookout for that. And that's it. You know, I appreciate everyone for taking time out, especially my colleagues, because we're wrapping up the semesters. And so it's a very busy time for us, but I enjoyed it. And I want to thank everybody for attending, and be on the lookout for other events soon to come.